So are you advancing the slides for me? Or am I advancing the slides? I should have asked that previously, right? There we go. Well, thanks very much. It's good to be here. It's always good to be back in Anchorage and enjoying the brew pubs with friends. What I'm going to do this morning is provide a brief overview of the potential in the Nanushuk and Torok formations, where significant discoveries have been announced over the last few years. And as an interesting background, I think the photograph here in the title slide is appropriate because this is Slope Mountain with the pipeline, the taps in the foreground, and the very white layer of sandstone near the lower part of the slope there is essentially in the same stratigraphic position as the stratigraphic traps that have been discovered in the Nanushuk in recent years. So that marks the boundary between the Torok Formation, the upper part of the Torok Formation, and the lower part of the slope, and the Nanushuk above. And so I've been spending a lot of time on that hillside looking for outcrop analogs for the discoveries that have been made in recent years. What I want to point out is that the background that I'm going to talk about today has been published in very general form. For example, in this fact sheet on the left shown here that was released in December of 2017 with our latest estimate of oil and gas undiscovered resources in the Torok and Nanushuk formations. And on the right, a couple of more technical papers, one that was published several years ago and the other one that is in press now that attempts to put into detail the USGS perspective of the geology and the resource potential of these two important formations. In my presentation today, I'm going to stick closer to the more generalized version of the presentation. If you are really interested in the technical details, feel free to send me an email. My email address will be on the last slide, and I'll be happy to fix you up with more information than you'll ever want. The stratigraphy of northern Alaska, shown here, is characterized by three rich oil-prone source rocks that are shown by the three green arrows. And the Torok and Nanushuk formations are located in an advantageous position just up section from those. So they're really in an ideal position in terms of the regional stratigraphy to receive a charge from one or all three of those source rocks. The seismic segment that I'm showing in the lower right there shows the Torok formation in green and the Nanushuk formation in yellow. And what this represents is a giant shelf margin system that marched from west to east across the Alaska North Slope. The sand was derived from Russia, so for once we got something from Russia and didn't have to give up anything. These formations extend over a huge area, more than 450 square kilometers, on the Chukchi Shelf, the North Slope of Alaska, and the adjacent Beaufort Shelf. Significantly, prior to 2015, the largest oil accumulations that had been discovered in stratigraphic traps in these formations will probably ultimately produce less than 10 million barrels of oil each. In addition to that, these formations had been penetrated by at least 150 exploration wells through the years. And I think it's fair to say that most of industry had long ago concluded that there was very minor potential in these two formations for very giant oil accumulations. So the discoveries that have been announced over the last 3 years are really significant and really change the perspective, I think, of the geological community in terms of the potential for resources in these two formations. Of significance here is this is a cartoon cross-section from Brooks Range on the south to the Beaufort Sea Shelf on the north. And it shows the major structure that has concentrated much of the oil and gas accumulations on the North Slope, and that is the Barrow Arch, the prominent feature that lies just beneath the coastline or slightly offshore. I've now superimposed on there the three source rocks that I pointed out in the previous slide. So the Triassic Schulich Formation, the Jurassic Lower Kingack Formation, and the Cretaceous Pebble Shale Unit and Gamma Ray Zone, as it's called, of the Hughes Shale. And if I now drape on there a couple of indicators of how hot these rocks have been heated in the past, I'm showing a green dashed line and a red dashed line. Between the green and red dashed lines lies what the oil industry refers to as the oil window. That means those formations have been buried to a temperature that is ideal for the generation and preservation of oil. Below the red line, the formations are in what is known as the gas window, which means that the temperature they've been exposed to has been so high that any hydrocarbon, any oil has been cracked to natural gas. The green box at the top represents the area where Nanushuk and Torok discoveries have been announced in recent years. And as you can see, they're in an ideal location to receive an oil charge from both directly underneath, where the source rocks are in the oil window, and also from both the south and the deeper part of the basin and from the north offshore. So the Barrow Arch has acted as a focal point for oil and gas migrating really vertically from south to north and from north to south during the past 100 million years or so. And so the fairway that the Nanushuk and Torok formations lie in this favorable position is up to about 80 to 100 miles wide north-south and extends for at least that far and probably much farther east-west. So this is a new fairway in which discoveries have already been made that are significant, but the surface has barely been scratched in terms of exploration potential. This is a map based on seismic analysis, and what I'm going to focus on is the area that is yellow, that huge area that covers all of NPRA and a narrow area east of NPRA, as well as the offshore, both in the Chukchi Shelf and the Beaufort Shelf north of NPRA. In that area, the complete Torok Formation and the Nanushuk Formation are present. So it's as if that area is depicted by the seismic section in the lower right in the area where the Nanushuk is present. So literally, there is potential for these types of discoveries across that entire area. The three red blobs on there, the eastern red blob represents the Pika Narwhal Horseshoe Trend. The middle red blob represents the Willow area, and the blob up there to the left in Smith Bay represents the area where Kalis announced the discovery in the Torok Formation. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the Nanushuk, but I'll also touch on the Torok near the end of the conversation. So I said this big wedge of sediment prograded across Alaska from west to east. And what I've shown here are big blue arrows that indicate the sediment transport direction. And the dotted lines they're shown on there are what we refer to as shelf margins. Those are areas where the shelf edge was favorable for the concentration of stratigraphic traps in the Nanushuk Formation, and down at the toe of the slope, if you go down the seismic figure, in the Torok Formation as well. This is a cartoon looking westward that sort of depicts how this depositional system looked while these important rocks were being deposited. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, but it is a fairly intricate system that was predominantly characterized by this huge progradation of a shelf margin and deltaic type system from the Russian Chukotka area, which is in the foreground there, or in the background there, into the Colville Basin, where the discoveries have been made in the foreground. This is another seismic section that I want to talk about very briefly because it sort of sets up how we think about oil and gas potential in this system. You'll notice in the seismic section at the north, which extends all the way from the Chukchi Shelf on the left to the Canning River on the right. And what you'll see there is that I've indicated with a couple of red arrows something that's very important about these depositional systems. And I guess I don't have a pointer. Oops, shouldn't have pointed. And what's important here is that to the west of those red arrows, you might notice that it's very difficult to see any kind of stratification in the green part of the figure in the Torok Formation. To the right of those red arrows, you can see dark-colored seismic reflectors that dip from west to east downward. And what those represent are snapshots in time of a shelf edge system that included the potential for accumulations near the shelf edge in the Nanushuk Formation and at the toe of the slope in the Torok Formation. And I've just put a couple of cartoons from a Geology 1 type textbook at the bottom of this figure. The potential in the Nanushuk Formation is in what we would refer to as either high stand or a falling stage type of deposit. What does that mean? That means that there was a lot of sand being concentrated right at the shelf edge. And those shelf edges are what I depicted by the dashed lines on the previous map, and that is the location where the discoveries like Pica and Willow have been made. So they're very key ingredients that can be identified in 2D seismic data, and certainly with much more precision and much more emphasis in 3D seismic data. The Torok Formation, in contrast, was deposited like in the lower right cartoon, where sea level fell below that shelf edge and the sand was cycled to the toe of the slope. And in this cartoon, you see a little pod of sand there, and that's the type of sedimentary deposit that the Torok discoveries have been made in, such as the one in Smith Bay. So let's talk about the Torok, or the Nanushuk Formation for a little bit and the discoveries that have been made. Are they all the same? You know, is Pica, Narwhal, Horseshoe Trend the same as the Willow Trend? My argument is that they are not, that they're two fundamentally different types of accumulations, and I illustrate that in this 3D seismic volume from the NPRA. And if I just advance this a little bit, I'm going to emphasize, first of all, what I call falling stage deposit on the left that I've labeled with some letters there, and I've painted in green the area where reservoir potential and stratigraphic trapping potential exists. Oops, I colored that yellow. I can't quite see that far. Sorry. In contrast, labeled in blue here, or colored in blue, is what I refer to as a high stand deposit, and that, I think, is a different looking beast than the one in yellow that I showed just earlier. The one in yellow, and I'm not going to go through all the details here, has certain geological characteristics that make it distinctive to recognize, and I think that's an analog for the Pica type stratigraphic traps that have been discovered. And on the right, and highlighted in green, are certain characteristics of the high stand type Nanushuk deposits, and I think those are analogs for the Willow type discovery. Now, bear in mind, I'm basing this on public domain data and data that I'm able to license as the USGS. I am not using information from the companies that have made these discoveries to make these interpretations. So Joe may say I'm totally wrong in a few minutes. Looking at that same seismic volume, this is an illustration of how the oil industry identifies seismic amplitude anomalies that essentially have the potential to represent stratigraphic traps that are charged with oil and or gas. The hot colors, the warm colors, those are good. The cold colors are bad in terms of a reservoir charged with hydrocarbons. And this particular seismic amplitude anomaly, which is untested, has not yet been drilled, covers an area of about 44 square miles, generally west of where drilling has taken place in recent years. And if you make some basic assumptions about reservoir thickness, this particular seismic anomaly has the potential to contain 200 to 400 million barrels of oil recoverable. So that essentially is the kind of evidence that we used when we evaluated the potential for undiscovered oil accumulations in these two formations, both across NPRA and in the adjacent state lands a year ago. The Torok Formation I'll spend less time on, but the bottom line is, as shown here in the Kokoda well log, the sand is cycled across the shelf, down the slope, and deposited in what we call turbidites, deep water sands, in the Torok Formation. And again, the stratigraphic trapping potential there is significant, just as it is in the Nanushuk. There is a fundamental difference between the two. These plots are porosity permeability. What the hell does that mean? The horizontal axis is porosity, how much open space exists in the sandstone where oil or gas can accumulate. The vertical axis is permeability, how easily can fluids move through the formation. The higher the porosity, the higher the permeability, the better reservoir quality. The upper diagram on the left illustrates that as you go from north to south across the north slope, the reservoir quality in the Nanushuk Formation typically deteriorates. So the highest porosity, highest permeability, upper right part of that plot, those are wells in the north, and the lower left part of the plot, lower porosity, lower permeability, those wells are farther south. The lower cartoon, or the lower plot on the lower right, is from the Torok Formation, and I've outlined on that plot the data field from the Nanushuk. And the only comment I'll make there is that in general, because the Torok is older than the Nanushuk and was buried to deeper depths, reservoir quality typically is not as good in the Torok as it is in the Nanushuk. So those are just some general observations, and I'll come back to those in a minute. So when we published our new assessment, our updated assessment of these two formations across NPRA and the adjacent state lands a year ago, we estimated that the Torok and Nanushuk together might contain as much as 8.7 billion barrels of undiscovered oil across this region, but that's the mean estimate. And to analyze that a bit, let's look at this figure. These are probability plots. So in the upper right is a probability plot of the total recoverable oil we estimate to be present in the Nanushuk Formation in just the northeastern part of this study area. The mean there is 4-point-some billion barrels. I can't read it from here, but what this plot is intended to show is that there is a large range of uncertainty. So we're absolutely certain that there is a little bit of oil recoverable from these plays. There's a small probability of a huge amount of oil in these plays, and the average is the 4-point-some billion barrels in this area that we show there. The reason that I'm stressing the uncertainty is that even though the discoveries that have been made have some big preliminary numbers associated with them, over 1 billion barrels in the case of the Pick a Horseshoe trend, I think between 400 and 750 million barrels in the Willow area. And the truth is, we will not know exactly how much recoverable oil is present until horizontal laterals are drilled and production procedures are undertaken. This figure, I just want to emphasize two things. One thing is that in the areas in NPRA that are colored light blue and dark blue, and in the state lands colored yellow and kind of reddish, those are areas that are already held by leases. So those are not available for future lease sales. The big pink or light purple area to the west is the area in NPRA that was originally opened in the early lease sales in '99 and subsequent lease sales, and then were withheld from leases ever since. So really the only way that a company that's not already leaseholder in this play or in these plays can get into this area, into these plays, is if that off-limits area in NPRA is open. And you heard this morning that there are reconsiderations underway for the NPRA development plan. I emphasized a minute ago the uncertainty in resource estimates. And a couple of years ago, I live in the woods. A couple of years ago, a wild turkey hen made a nest a stone's throw from my house. And every day she would get off her nest and run around the yard and take a dirt bath and eat. And I snuck out one day and took a picture of her nest, and there were 13 eggs there. So the question is, how many turkeys came out of that, right? So those eggs are sort of analogous to 3D seismic anomalies, like I showed you previously, that have not yet been tested. There are a lot of eggs out there, a lot of seismic anomalies, dozens of them that have not been tested. We don't yet know what proportion of those seismic anomalies will yield discoveries that are economically viable. So just to go back, it's almost like deja vu, depending on the way the outcome works. In 2010, this is a figure that we published when we reduced the oil potential at NPRA in the Jurassic plays. We were very bullish on this play, these plays, the alpine plays essentially extended westward, because we thought that the alpine-type oil charge may extend all the way across NPRA, or at least a significant difference. Well, what we discovered, or what the oil industry discovered, was within about 20 or 25 miles of alpine field, the traps, the exploration revealed that the traps are full of a lot of gas, a lot of condensate, and a little oil. And so the results of that exploration program in the 2000 and subsequent years are kind of represented in a snapshot here. The yellow dots with the line connecting them are the leases, the number of leases held or active leases by year. And the bar diagrams, the bar plots, are the number of exploration and delineation wells drilled. So you can see what happened around 2010. Yes, discoveries were made, and those discoveries are substantial, but there also were a lot of dry holes drilled, and there was also a lot more gas found than expected in an oil play. So you can see that the lease holding, because of leases being relinquished and expiring, dropped from about 4 million acres down to less than 2 million acres. Or actually, those are, 400 leases down to about 200 leases, but that equates to about millions of acres also. And you can see that since the discovery of the Torok Nanushuk pools, things have picked up, but the number of active leases has remained fairly low, and that's mainly because of the area that is off limits in NPRA. So at any rate, you can almost imagine that last handful of wells since 2013 on this plot as being analogous to the beginning of the drilling in 2000. Will this go up, or will this roll over and go back down? You know, I think there's a lot of optimism that it will go up and will continue to go up, but just like the turkey eggs, we don't yet know. So I have some conclusions there, but I have a feeling that I've run pretty long already. The bottom line here is that we estimate that there's a lot of oil in these plays. However, we have a large uncertainty range around that. So what we're saying is we are unsure, but when we build in all of the probability considerations that we can make, we think that there's going to be on the order of 8+ billion barrels of oil to be discovered in these two plays in this area. The other thing is that because of the reservoir quality that I talked about, and because of infrastructure considerations and depth of drilling, it is our anticipation that the Nanushuk stratigraphic traps will be the main driver for exploration, and that the Torok exploration is likely to be limited to number one, areas that already have infrastructure developed and where companies are willing to take a shot at the higher risk deeper. And number two, if oil prices rise to the point where economic viability reaches into lower quality reservoirs. So with that, I'll say thanks very much.